Okay, so this is our last lesson for this week under the content, which is context of communication. The last one left for us to do is organizational communication. Okay, for this lesson or this session, we will look at the different types of organizational structures, two specifically, and then illustrate those types and move on to looking at organizational communication and specific terms that are relevant to organizational communication, and then explain the flow of communication in organizations, which is very, very easy. The slide itself, the PowerPoint will look like a whole lot of things, but in truth, it's not so much, okay? Because a lot of the slides have images, and the images themselves require a little bit of explanation, or they're simply being presented by way of examples. The first structure that we want to look at will be the TAL structure. But before we look at that, in order for us to understand why we want to look at two structures, it's important first to just consider what an organizational structure means. And here we're looking at how the tasks within a workplace are divided, how people perform at the job, and what roles we occupy. So the TAL structure. The TAL structure focuses on presenting what we call many levels of hierarchy. It means that you might have someone in charge, and the person directly in charge, like a CEO or someone at the top, a manager or so, that person is in charge, and then there are lots of other people below that person. This one, let me try to use an example for you. Like CJC. CJC has a TAL structure. We look at who is in charge all the way at the top. We have, some people might dispute, but we have the board that we answer to, and that would be the direct, or the one that is specifically in charge of everything that takes place at the school, or like, for example, actions that we take towards class schedules and running of the school and the operation of the school. That comes from the board. But some people might tell me right now that the board still answers, or the school itself still answers to the ministry. And that's correct. The Ministry of Education is the actual ultimate boss per se, or the one that runs every school in the country. So yes, if we were to do the actual structure of the school, we'd start from the top, which is the ministry itself. Then we would look at the board, and then under the board we have the dean, the assistant dean, and they might be at the administrative level, what we would consider the administrative level. And then under them you have your HODs, then the teachers, and then you have support staff, etc. Right? So all it is saying that is, in a TAL structure, we have many levels of hierarchy. Okay? And then that will determine what kind of communication takes place within the organization with a TAL structure. And that's where we're headed. The next slide focuses still on TAL structure, just so you get a clearer picture. You'll see on the left-hand side, we have the managing director as an example, and then maybe other people as in other managerial positions, then the staff. I explained that just now with the previous slide in using CJC as an example. It says here, though, that the TAL structure has several advantages, and at the same time it has several disadvantages. Okay? So for example, there's a short list. It says, in terms of advantages, it's easier to supervise staff, especially if you have a lot of people. Right? Think about us at CJC. We have 30-something teachers, 32 I believe. And so if you had one person in charge of supervising 32 people, that would be a very difficult or demanding task on that one person who has to do all the supervision. But because you have different levels of hierarchy, you have the administrative level, and they supervise the HODs, and then the HODs supervise specific teachers within their department, and so on. Okay, so the job of supervising becomes a little bit easier. Then, of course, there are roles within the company that are clearly defined, because now you know exactly what you're to do, and the load of the work or the bulk of things don't fall on any one person, because I am responsible to do certain things only. Another person is responsible to do another bunch of tasks, and that's it. Those would be easy to understand if we consider different kinds of TAL structure for different organizations. And then, of course, there's more opportunity for promotion because you have different levels. And then the last one, it says manageable workload for employees. I think that goes with the idea of clearly defined roles, because it means that you get certain tasks and you will execute those and only those, right? Disadvantages, of course, it's very slow in making decisions. And that's easy to understand in the sense that because there are set communication protocols, somebody who is what we would call at a lower level has to communicate information to somebody who is in a higher position, and that person may need to relay information to somebody yet in a higher position. Let's use CJC as an example still, since we already talked about the TAL structure at CJC. For example, if I want leave for something, or I want permission for something, I have to communicate that to my HOD, and then my HOD will communicate that to whomever is above my HOD. So I cannot just get permission easily. I have to wait for permission for certain things. And I could use that as one example, but I could also use it in the sense of, like, for example, if maternity leave or like extended sick leave, or if I wanted to take a year leave with pay or with half pay or without pay or whatever it is, I have to apply, and it means that I have to fill out all of these papers at the office and submit them through our office to the dean. Then the dean has to take that to the board. The dean will recommend or not recommend, but let's say the dean recommends. The dean would take it to the board, which is the governing body at our school. The board would say, okay, we approve this, but then it has to go to ministry. Then at the ministry level, the Teaching Service Commission reviews the paperwork, and then they send back whether it is approved, it is granted. They send that back. Then that information trickles down finally to the person who applied. So it takes a long time. It takes a process. And so, like, for example, if I go on maternity leave, I have to apply so many months in advance before the actual date of confinement, which is when you'll have your child, right? So it does take a while, and that's definitely a disadvantage. The second disadvantage is that workers have little freedom or responsibility, and we'll go with the freedom, because you have certain things that you need to do, and there is a set supervisor for each person. You do not have the freedom to do what you believe would be in the best interest of the company or so. You have to answer to somebody, and so you have to do what that person says. The next one is that we have many levels of management, and that could create some difficulties in getting things done, getting permission to do things, the movement that takes place within the organization, among other things. And then, of course, the last one is that there's high labor cost attached to it, because you have to pay so many people. Okay? Let's move to the next one. It says here that, the TAL structure here. Oh, the flat structure. Shoots, I can't even see well enough. The flat structure, that's the next type of structure. And the flat structure itself here says that what the organization operates with fewer levels of hierarchy than the TAL structure. That's because maybe the organization doesn't employ a whole lot of people and you don't need that kind of different positions such as management and supervisors and so on. So you have fewer levels, and I like to think about this as an example. Think about a local neighborhood store, your local Chinese store. For example, let's do Henry's on College Road. Think about how many people are employed there, and so then how many levels of hierarchy we have. You might have one person who is in charge, which might be the boss, and that boss might function for several roles too. But let's just say we have the boss, and then you have one direct person in charge of everything else, and everybody else is at the same level, something like that, right? In a smaller shop, like for example, we have the shop across from Henry's, which is a family-owned shop, pet shop, right? For that family, it might be one person owns the shop. That same person stocks the shop, does the accounting for the shop, does inventory, keep it running, does cashier, etc. So then you don't have a lot of people, or it might be direct family members who help out at the shop. All right, so it's a flat structure. The next one presents example here. Okay, you could see on the left hand side where you might have just one manager and everybody else, right? So it's easy to communicate. Again, the advantages here, because you have few management levels, that is one advantage. A second one is that the communication is faster. So for example, if I want to ask for a day off, I don't have to fill out a whole lot of paperwork. I don't have to let that paperwork get sent. I don't have to wait for a response and all of that. I could just say, you know what, tomorrow I really need to go to get my passport. Can I get the day off? And it's like, okay, right away somebody can give me a prompt response. Okay? And then there's quick decision making, which I just explained. Disadvantages, there's greater workload because you don't have a lot of people. That one manager has a lot of things to do in that respect. And then fewer promotion opportunities, because at what point do you get the opportunity to be a manager if there's only one managerial position, right? So you have to probably wait until that person retire or otherwise. Then it says employees must multitask. And in that respect, more training is required because they might need to do more than one thing. And so you have to be flexible at that job in perhaps doing one task and then moving to a different one and so on. So a lot of training may be required. Like I said, it might be the person acting as cashier, might also be doing the accounting, might also be taking stock of inventory, and so on. A whole lot of different tasks, all right? And then we look at what is organizational communication. Now that we know what the two structures are, the TAL structure and the flat structure, we look at what is organizational communication. And this applies to both TAL structures and flat structures, okay? That is another, the idea of looking at organizations is to determine that as a context, and how then does the communication that takes place within the different contexts gets affected by the people involved, and of course the actual setting, right? Organizational communication defined is the exchange of oral, nonverbal, and the written messages among people who work together in an attempt to accomplish what would be a common goal, okay? And if we consider the different types now, because that's very important here, we have what would be formal communication structure and then informal. But let's talk about the formal first. And what is considered formal communication structure within an organization is the communication that is going to take place through what we consider officially designated channels. That simply means that these are set communication channels for you to communicate, right? And these could be things that are written in like policy books for the organization, organizational charts, And the slide that I showed you with the tile structure, where you had like one person in one position and then you had so many people under that person and so on, that looks at the organizational structure, and then an organizational chart provides you what positions different people assume. Okay. The communication then happens through what we call officially designated channels, and those would be considered the formal communication structure. There are actually 4, and they're listed right there under flow of formal communication. It says here that we have downward communication, upward communication, horizontal communication, and then the vertical communication. And they're very, very simple to understand. Let's talk first about the downward communication. It says here that it's communication that goes from the top to the bottom, down, right? Who's at the top and how that communication goes down. Remember, down. So it's looking at communication from what we call superiors, because superiors would be the people in the managerial position. And remember, anybody at the bottom, and I don't like to use the word top and bottom because it sounds, but you know what I mean. So people in a lower level are going to be referred to as subordinates. And then the people who are above them will be referred to as superiors. All right, so communication taking place from the superior to the subordinate is what we call downward communication. There are different reasons for communicating in that downward means. To maybe give instructions to get a job done, to maybe point out why it is that certain things need to be done, and of course many other things, right? And then there's upward communication. The upward communication is the opposite of the downward, of course. And so then we're looking at the communication coming from the bottom going upward. So the subordinate now has to communicate with the superior for many different reasons as well. Okay? Whether you're expressing some job-related problem, or whether you're making a request for something, and so on. Okay? Then there's the vertical communication. This is just the flow, the upward and downward flow of communication within an organization. So subordinates communicating with superiors, superiors communicating with subordinates, that is what we consider vertical communication. Okay? And then of course, the last one, which is last formal flow of communication, is the horizontal, and this one goes across. In this case, when we say across, we're referring to when people at the same level communicate. So for example, one manager can communicate with another manager. Like in our case, I was using CJC earlier. If one HOD communicates with another HOD, that's at the same level. So then that's horizontal communication. One staff member communicates with one staff member. In terms of like teacher to teacher communication, again, that's horizontal communication. It's happening at the same level, okay? Then we move from the formal flow of communication to what we consider the informal flow of communication. In this case, it's not any kind of communication that is happening through what we mentioned as officially designated channels. In this case, it is coming more from informal means, and so it's more communication that happens among people within the organization, but it's not exactly job related. It could be job related, but not necessarily for that purpose. We call this one grapevine communication. So it results from maybe just social interests of the employees, or maybe personal interests. Okay? It could be like, maybe, let's just say, let me give an example. If I say, if I come to school and I tell one of the other teachers, or I mention to one of the HODs, or I mention to the dean or to the assistant dean, or anybody who works with me at CJC, if I say, oh, I heard that we're going to get a new teacher next week. because we need a new teacher. That isn't anything official, right? I'm not communicating it to the person who is my superior, or I'm not communicating it horizontally to another teacher. I'm just sharing that information, and it's an informal way of communicating. People like to call grapevine communication chisme, right? And yes, I guess we could accept it as that in some cases, right? And it's just communication that take place. And it's, even if I'm just asking somebody, oh, so how are you doing? I heard you were sick last week. Are you feeling better now? See, that's communication that is looking at maybe just on a personal level that I am having with somebody who works with me, but it's not really following any set communication channel that we should be utilizing. All right. And so it does work, though, in terms of an advantage to create a more relaxed and comfortable climate within the organization. And then, of course, though, as a disadvantage, we should not ever make that be the primary means of communication for any effective communication that would take place. We should respect the formal systems and go with that rather than relying on just, let me tell you what's happening, right? So that's informal. I have some pointers there in terms of advantages and disadvantages. We look at the speed, the idea that it provides valuable feedback. You could check up on people's emotions. It helps to give them a little push, a little booster. Because, as human beings, we could work with all of that, right? Disadvantages, it ends up spreading rumors. Sometimes messages get distorted. So by the time it really, really gets to the people who should be receiving the message, it's a whole mess. So we want to avoid things like that. It could affect productivity, especially if it's spreading rumors about someone. Because, like, for example, if you had somebody rumoring and saying, let's say, you say, oh, you heard the latest? What is it? Well, Miss Yvette is, let me think, what could be a rumor at school? Oh, Miss Yvette is going to get fired. And so that could affect my productivity at the job, because then what if it's just talk and it's not any truth? Okay. So then I might be worried and I might be sad about it. And so it would affect how I perform at the job. So that's the third one. And then the last one, it lacks control, because of course people will just talk, and then so nobody can nip it and say, oh, that's not a formal means, that's not an acceptable means, because people will just talk. Then there's the term, because remember we're looking at related terms too, which is organizational culture. And organizational culture defined looks at the beliefs, expectations, values, and norms that influence how people relate to each other and how that helps in them achieving the goals of the organization. If you have people who, for example, believe in being responsible, believe in accountability, believe in honesty, and all of that, then you will likely have them work towards achieving the goal, and there will be minimum time wasted. You'll have them engaged, and so the job will get done. All right? That's the organizational culture. And of course, you go to some workplaces, and I hate to say this, but like a lot of people talk bad about government offices because they say like the organizational culture that exists in government offices is that people who work there seem to not give their best at the job. But I guess that varies from place to place. Then the other term is communication climate. And that simply looks at the interaction, the kind of interaction that happens between or among people who work together. Because you could tell, for example, if you go to a place and the people who work there actually like each other and the communication helps how they perform and how they serve people, as opposed to if you had a group of people who work at a particular establishment or an organization, and when you visit, they're all miserable, they don't talk to each other, and that transmits to the customers who they serve. Okay, so that's actually something that people would want to build on. The communication climate, just to share with you, it has 5 different dimensions. The idea of supportiveness, people being supportive of each other. There's participative decision making. Everybody participates, and as a result, because people feel included, then the decision is more acceptable, and then they work towards achieving the goal together because they have been part of the decision itself. There's trust, confidence, and credibility. If people trust each other, and they will work better, they will believe and rely on each other for the job to get done. There's openness and candors, and that's actually something that promotes good communication climate. If you can be open to, one, accept people's criticism, and open enough to say the truth, like give honest feedback, that helps, because then people can rectify their flaws, and that's helpful to any organization. The last one is high performance goals. That looks at, as a group, as an organization, you set these goals, and once everyone is on board, then they work towards achieving the goals. The next term is communication competence. This looks at the ability to communicate both appropriately and effectively with other people. That's easy to understand, right? The image has a couple of things that would promote good communication competence. It just looks at you being able to communicate well enough with people. All right, the last 2 things that we will look at is internal communication and external communication. Internal communication looks at communication that takes place with people who work together. The employees communicate with each other. At every different level. So the managers, the colleagues, subordinates, that communication takes place. So you're looking at communication in the organization itself. Okay? There's a little image there that shows internal communication. Okay, from the top to the bottom to the top, etc. So all of that, as long as it is communication that takes place within the organization. The opposite, of course, would be external communication. And this is communication that takes place outside of the organization. It would be the organization communicating with others outside of the organization. Okay? And I could give you some easy examples. I like to think about, as an example, I like to think about when our school has Expo. I know I've used Expo for a number of different examples, but it's easy to understand. When we have Expo, what happens is that we, as an institution, we invite others from outside to come to our school to visit us for the Expo. We showcase students' work, we showcase what we've prepared you to do, and so we invite, whether we're inviting people from other schools, so then they send out email or letters to other schools to invite them. They might invite the media to come do coverage. They might invite businesses to set up their booths. So all of that then would be good examples of what is external communication. If you look at the image here, it gives you another example, or it gives you an organization and so many different possibilities of what kind of external communication could occur. So the organization could maybe send out flyers to customers on like promotions, like right now, for example, Quality Chicken or all of those places that are having promotions. They send out their flyers with information to invite customers to come in and buy. I'll pick some of these, and then you could see what I'm talking about. They could communicate externally with shareholders, like for example the credit union right now. Their membership is their shareholders, so they are communicating with their membership right now in order to make necessary arrangements for maybe people's expenses or unforeseen monetary or financial constraints. And so they have sent out some release. I'm not too sure what is the offer that is being made to the people of the credit union. I don't know if it's in regards to loans or whatever it might be, but they send out information to their shareholders, right? It could be that they're sending information to the tax department, to a lawyer, to the media, and so on. All right? So anything by way of that. And I gave you an example of that earlier. The other thing here, I kind of like this one in terms of what kinds of communication could take place or in what forms. And then they would count as either internal communication or external communication, or truthfully, it could occur in both, right? So examples here, like newsletters, could be specifically for a particular group. Like the Teaching Service Commission has a bulletin, and it's only for teachers. So, or within that organization itself, they would produce newsletters for them, right? Emails, when an organization or like our school, when they send out an email to the staff, it goes to the teachers and the people who work there at the organization. So that's internal communication. You might have a telephone tree. It could be a website that only members can access, meetings, manuals, or training sessions that take place. Okay, and that would be for internal communication only. On the other side, we have external advertisements, news releases, press conferences, speaking engagements, special events, or lobbying with external entities. And then, of course, in the middle, what could be classified as internal communication but also external communication would be a general website that both members and non-members can access. Social media, if you have an account on a social media network, your employees and those outside can access it. Flyers, photography, videography, those all count as things that could fall under internal or examples of internal and external communications. All right, that brings us to the end, really. The other two slides, 25 and 26, are presenting an activity. So I will leave you with the activity. Let me just quickly explain. It says here that you're to study the set of images on the last slide and carefully determine what type of communication is taking place in each of the pictures, right? And then it says A, B, C, D, E, F. Your options here are what we've studied, which would be downward communication, upward communication, horizontal communication, vertical communication, internal communication, and external communication. Those are your options, right? So if you look at the image, what then is A? What do you think? What is B? What is C? What is D? You see F and you see E and then you see F. So the options are what I mentioned just now: downward, upward, horizontal, vertical, internal, external. If you can identify those, then you pretty much got what we were talking about. Okay? All right. That's the end of this one. I'll give instructions further.